Hello, and welcome back to the About Your Body podcast. Today, we are speaking with midwife Mary McGowan, and we are talking all about midwifery, labour and delivery, and all of your questions surrounding birth. Just a trigger warning, this podcast does talk about miscarriage. We're also going to be talking about butterfly babies and touching on postpartum depression. Thank you all so much for listening. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, thank you so much for making the time to do this. How are you going?
Yeah, good, Rachel. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you. Would you mind if we just start off, if you could explain to the listeners a little bit about what you do for work?
Sure. So I'm a midwife. I've been a midwife for probably 20 odd years, nearly 30 years probably. I came to midwifery from nursing because when I was pregnant, I had midwifery care, and I was so impressed by the relationships I developed with my caregivers and what an impact they had in my life. I thought, I want to do that. So I went back to university and studied midwifery for a couple of years. And then I've worked for a midwife ever since then. I started off working in a traditional hospital setting, but then progressed to working in a small group practice with 3 other midwives for a number of years. And that was fantastic because I gave comprehensive care to women throughout their whole pregnancy and up to 6 weeks after they had their baby. It was an enormous job, but enormously rewarding. And, you know, as midwives, we're so privileged to be invited into that space that's so intimate and private in a couple's life. So then I progressed to managing midwifery teams. And I've worked in a variety of settings. I've worked in high-risk midwifery with adolescents and women with substance and alcohol misuse. And again, that was a rewarding experience. I think as a midwife, we're there to support women's choices and help to guide them on their journey through their pregnancy and help them to make good choices for the health. With the disadvantaged women, you may not have such big changes, but the measure's different, and even a small positive change is a change in those women's lives, you know, for better outcomes for them and their families. I think the role of a midwife is more than just preparing a woman and supporting her through her pregnancy and labour and birth. I think it's about helping women be good, confident mothers as the outcome. And I think sometimes midwives forget that. I think the most important thing to always remember that it's about women's choices and not be guided by your choice as a woman and your experience, but to really listen to what a woman says and what she wants. More recently, I work as a manager of midwifery service in a hospital where we do probably 2,000 births a year. So I manage a very busy maternity service with 6 birthing rooms, a busy postnatal antenatal service, and a special care nursery. So that's my work life in a nutshell.
Wow, thank you. Sounds like you've had such a, what's the word, perhaps diverse career, never just stuck to it sounds like you don't have many boring days. Is the hospital that you manage now, is that all public, that service with the birthing rooms and
No, so the service, so I was a manager for many years in the public sector, but in the last probably 10 years, not quite 10 years, I've been working in a private hospital.
Okay.
And the joke was, when I got there, the obstetricians whom I'd worked with on and off years before had said, oh my gosh, here comes the hardcore birth centre midwife, Mary McGowan, to the private sector. We don't believe that. And I said, well, here I am, you know, and I always reiterate the same thing. I'm here to support women's choices and make sure women get the choices and support that they need. And, you know, a large proportion of women choose private healthcare and private obstetric care, and that's a valid choice for them. And what I want to make sure is that they have the best care and the best experience and the best start to parenting that they can have.
Can you be my midwife?
Sure.
Thank you. That's that sounds like an incredibly holistic approach, and I'd love to get into this a little bit further on as well. Is a lot of I think people generally, there's a conception that midwives are just about babies. And I remember you once saying to me that it's actually all about women, the
All
people
about,
giving birth.
all about women. I
Mm.
remember a young family friend was wanting to do midwifery, and I was chatting to her, and I said, "So why do you want to do midwifery?" "Because I love babies." And I thought, wrong answer. I say, yeah, the outcome, but it's about women and supporting women.
If I were to go into birth, I would want a midwife who cared about me and the baby, but not just the baby. That's really, really, really comforting to hear. Thank you. Do you think your job is emotional or taxing, difficult, enjoyable, fun?
All of those.
Okay.
I mean, it's always a gift. The experience of being with a family, it never gets old. A baby being born is never old. It doesn't matter how many babies you birth. You can ask any midwife. Every birth is special. It can be very emotionally taxing. Certainly when I worked in my group practice, because you followed the women throughout the pregnancy, and then you were on call, most days and nights for waiting for them to go into labour. It's not like being employed in a hospital where you went in for an 8-hour shift and then it's done.
Right.
You may be supporting those women for hours and hours, or maybe even days, chatting to them on the phone, popping in to visit them, just reassuring them before, active labour starts, and then you're there for the long haul. So it can be very physically and emotionally draining.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I found, it's particularly working in natural birthing, it's so intimate that I found at times when I got home that I just wanted my own space. I didn't want, my son climbing over me, being touched. You just needed that time to get your own space and your own head back, because you are so closely involved physically with a woman. I think I read something the other day that the midwife has skilled hands but knows how to sit on them. And it is that having that knowledge and knowing when to act and knowing when to just watch. I recall I looked after a midwife colleague of mine many years ago. I've delivered a couple of her children, and she was showing photos, much later on, and there was a photo of me sitting on the edge of the bath in the birth centre, and I was just sitting, leaning back on the wall. She was in the bath, and she said, "Oh, Mary, that's just such a classic pose of yours, just sitting there watching."
I mean,
well, that doesn't sound very physically taxing, does it?
But, well, I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I would imagine that honestly, taking care of women, if you're an empathetic person, or if you have any empathy at all, whether you're an empath or not, um, being in such close proximity for a woman who might be giving birth who might be like in labor for 12 hours and is in a lot of pain and is sort of screaming in your face. I can imagine in a way you may take on some of that for yourself, and come home, and it sort of makes sense to me that you would need just space away from, especially from your child. It's like, no, you did this to me. I can't see you right now. Sorry.
That is just, I think it's just physical touching, because with women, you're touching them, you're rubbing their back, you've got your arm around them, encouraging them on, particularly when you're working in a birth centre where you are not encouraging the use of drugs. So it's much more a therapeutic use of self, and that's what's draining.
Okay. Could you just describe what a birth centre is for us?
So a birth centre is a natural birthing environment. So it's typically run by midwives, and it's low intervention, and it's generally for women who are low risk.
Okay. So if you perhaps needed a C-section, emergency C-section while you were in there, you'd have to be sent off to the hospital, to theatre?
So there's different types of birth centres. There are birth centres that are freestanding, and there's birth centres that are attached to tertiary referral hospitals. So there's still that ability to transfer women's care. But I think the skill of a good midwife is to be with a woman, observe how the labour is progressing, observe the well-being of the baby, and make sensible decisions before it's an emergency situation.
Right.
So that if you feel that things aren't going the way you expect and the baby, you're listening to its heart rate and you're not reassured, well, that's when you need to collaborate with, with our medical colleagues and make a different decision for the women.
Mm.
So I think the most important thing of giving care to the women is when you do the antenatal care and you're educating them, you talk about all the potential outcomes. And I think you'd enter into a relationship where the woman, it's a shared responsibility. There's a collaboration between you and the woman. And, she is always involved in any decision making. So I think, they talk about active birth, in the old days. Active birth was a woman up walking around, labouring on her feet, birthing, no intervention. But I think you can have a caesarean section and have an active birth if you're an active participant in, the decision-making processes that go along with it.
Right, okay.
Some people would disagree, but that's my interpretation of active birth.
I love your, I guess, I love your comparison that the woman and the midwife are in it together, that it's not just the midwife taking care of her, you've got to be in it. You have a responsibility, I suppose, in a way, and you can, I wouldn't say you can control your birth, definitely wouldn't say that, but I suppose how you can control how you behave. Would you say that's fair to say? Or kind of when you're in labour, does that go out the window?
That sort of goes out the window. I think the most important thing preparing for labour is to go in with as much information as you can, knowing what your choices might be, but being flexible. So that if something changes, that you're not going to be disappointed. I've worked as a midwife consultant with the postnatal depression service,
mm-hmm.
and I often found that the women who developed postnatal depression, usually there was often a link to unmet expectations. And then, when you dig a little deeper, you might look and see that these women have got a half a dozen page typed birth plan.
Okay.
And nothing goes right. Midwives, we laugh. The more in depth the birth plan, the less likely it is to happen.
Okay, I'm writing a 1-sentence birth plan then, and being aware that it's not going to plan. I was wondering your opinion on birth plans, but I think I know what it is.
I just say to my women, going into labour is a bit like going on the Big Dipper. You're really excited, you've got that anticipation, you get on the chair, they strap you in and you think, oh my gosh, and then it goes and you're up and down, and then you come out the end and think, that wasn't that bad.
Okay, good. And I think as well, what you said about active birth, you can have a caesarean and still have an active birth. I think there's a lot of stigma around having a C-section within the sort of, I guess you'd say, like a motherhood internet space, and it's like, oh, you didn't have a natural birth. But it's important to remember that everybody's birth is their own. It's not up to you. Oh, I suppose it is up to you as a midwife. It's not up to us to determine how somebody gives birth. And some people have to have caesareans, and even if they didn't have to, just angers me, that judgment that can often go on.
It's really interesting. There's so much societal comment around birth and pregnancy. If you were walking down the street, people wouldn't come up and touch your body and feel free just to rub their hand over your belly if you weren't pregnant. But you have a pregnant belly and everybody thinks it's a free-for-all to come up and touch a woman without permission. I always find that really incredible. The other thing, the whole yummy mummy phenomena is about how it's like a measure. You know, we have to do this way. We have to have a natural birth. We have to breastfeed our babies. We have to bounce back to our pre-pregnancy body, you know, as soon as we step outside the hospital. You know, and I think, you know, social media has a lot to answer for, because people are putting up these unrealistic expectations of what pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period looks like for a woman. And it's different for every woman.
And how damaging that is to be expected to look incredible after you've just given birth. And I think that speaks very strongly toward what the patriarchy speaks of the patriarchy, because why should it matter what you look like after giving birth at all? Like, you've done this amazing thing. I don't think that what you look like should be on the list whatsoever. And there's so much judgment now about whether you formula feed or breastfeed. And
Terrible.
yeah, and on About Your Body, that's not on. You can do whatever you like, as long as you're not giving the baby, you know, Coca-Cola. It's getting some sort of nutrient. It's fine.
You know, I've always taught midwifery students and the midwives that I work with, never say to a woman, so when you would admit a woman to the hospital, you know, you talk to them about what their intentions were, what was their plan, you know, how did they see their birth. You'd ask them, are they happy for the baby to have the immunizations post-birth? And people will say, are you breastfeeding? And I'd say, you can't ask women, are you breastfeeding? You need to say, how do you plan to feed? Because it's not a loaded question. As soon as you say to a woman, you're breastfeeding, and they want to say, well, no, I've made the choice not to, they're not going to say that. And you see it in hospitals where women will breastfeed because the midwife at birth doesn't ask them what their intention is. The baby's born, they whack it on the breast without getting permission from the woman. So then the woman will attempt to breastfeed for the next 12, 24 hours before somebody comes in and finds a crying woman and finds out what her intentions really are.
How sad, and how just old-fashioned it is. But I also hadn't thought about are you breastfeeding as a loaded question. You're totally right. It implies that you should be, if you're asking that question, rather than how you plan to feed the baby. Yeah, perfect. I mean, as long as she doesn't, like I said, as long as she doesn't say, I'm not going to feed the baby, I think you're fine, right?
I remember reading a paper years ago, and it was called like Managed, Laboured and Delivered, and it was written by a feminist writer, and it was all about the language around women and how we have to be so careful. So they, you know, old terms, when labour didn't progress as expected, it was fail to progress, you know, and it was all these negative words, you know, the baby's delivered instead of the woman giving birth, which is an action. You know, pizzas are delivered, babies are not delivered.
I hadn't thought about that either. There's I when I worked at the medical centre that I used to do reception at, there was I always saw coming in from paediatricians babies with failure to thrive, and I always thought that was such a funny name for a medical condition. And for people listening, failure to thrive essentially means like the baby's not like maybe
meeting its milestones.
I was going to say that. Yeah, perfect. Meeting its milestones, but also it would come in at like, it'd be like 11 weeks old, failure to thrive. And I'm not a doctor, so I can't comment on it, but I always just thought it was really strange. I was like, what are you supposed to be thriving at? You've just come onto the earth. You know? We're not winning Nobel Peace Prizes at 11 weeks old. But I think as well, I think you're going to agree with this by what we've talked about before, but I think there's a societal focus on pregnancy and the birth of babies, but there's a lot less attention on the people who are actually giving birth. And I wonder if you have any advice or thoughts on how society can support women through the postpartum period, like while their bodies are healing, they are adjusting to new motherhood, but all the attention is on the baby and not generally on them and how they're doing.
So COVID has been an absolute gift for birthing women, because we stopped having visitors coming to the hospital, and women were able to focus on themselves and their baby instead of feeling like they had to entertain their visitors. I think when you look at traditional societies, they have the 40 days lying in after the birth, where the community looks after the woman. And I think we can still do that in our communities today. I always say, don't go and visit a new mother unless you go with a casserole or you go intending, say, can I hang out that load of washing for you? Don't go to visit a new mother expecting to be a guest. You know, you need to really value that her role is to care for that baby and herself while she recovers. You know, and what I touched on before, the yummy mummy thing, it's, you know, that push for women to be out exercising at, you know, mothers groups and do, you know, because it's expected, when really sometimes they just want to be at home. It's okay to be at home. But I think we need to come together in our communities and create small village sort of ambience to support the birthing woman.
I mean,
I think
wow, yeah.
I think a lot of young women struggle nowadays because our we've got nuclear families, and we don't have a lot of women don't have that extended family where mothers, sisters, aunts will come in and support them. So I think there's a bit of a loss there. But what we did see with the COVID and no visitors was babies were feeding better. Babies were sleeping because they were left undisturbed. It was fantastic. And you weren't getting the parcel. So for women who chose to breastfeed, our breastfeeding success rates were much higher. We had far fewer babies in the hospital losing weight. Babies can typically lose up to about 10% of their birth weight in the first, 4 or 5 days. We weren't seeing that because women were feeding their babies instead of, oh, no, I'll just do that when my visitors go, because women are learning to mother a new baby, whether it's their first baby or the third baby. That baby is new to them at that moment. And they need, they're on a learning curve with that baby in that initial period, and it's not often left undisturbed.
Wow. I mean, do you think that having the opportunity to rest means that the milk can come in quicker or more efficiently? And I assume babies lose their body weight because the colostrum's just come in and they're not actually drinking real milk. Is that right?
And now the colostrum is very nutritive and, high in calories but low in volume. But what you need to do is put the baby to the breast often to encourage the milk to come in. It's a biochemical reaction, and it works on a feedback mechanism that the baby goes to the breast. The breast is stimulated. It sends a message to a part of the brain that releases some hormones that send another feedback back to the breast to make and release milk.
Okay, right. So rest is not even can't hurt, would help. Wow, that's so interesting. I would have thought that having less support during COVID, less physical support, would be a huge disadvantage. But I suppose, with everything you've just said, that's such an interesting insight. Thanks for sharing.
It was very distressing for families, particularly, when siblings couldn't come into the birthing space. But in retrospect, when you spoke to women, they said, "Oh, that was really good."
Good. That's great. I would love to know, how do you support women through their birth and labour? Like, does your job stop at medical intervention, or I assume it extends to emotional support as well? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the midwife is the one constant through the birth. Women who choose to have obstetric care, the obstetrician may come in at the end to for want of a better word, deliver the baby. But the midwife is the constant.
Okay.
You provide, even women who choose medical forms of pain relief, it's administered by the midwife. The observation and the monitoring of the labour and the baby's heart rate, are all done by the midwife. If a woman for some reason goes for an emergency caesarean section, or if a woman in fact has a planned caesarean section, there is always a midwife who goes with her.
Okay, so always a midwife, sometimes a
Always
doctor.
always a midwife.
Right, okay. And is it generally the kind of thing, like, do you see a lot of births where the OBGYN might not even come in at all?
I mean, in my previous work, yes, absolutely. Probably most of them. But obviously, working in the private sector, the women have made a choice to have an obstetrician as their primary carer.
Okay.
So the staff do ensure that the doctor is there. But I mean, if they don't make it, they don't make it. I remember doing a presentation many years ago about the triangle of trust. So where I spoke before about the collaborative relationship with the woman and the midwife, it's a triangle of trust with our medical colleagues as well.
Okay,
And
collaborative relationship. I love that.
I think that's really important.
Okay.
I think you might go on to some other midwifery. If you look at some of the websites, it can almost suggest that it's a competitive relationship. I don't agree with that at all. And I have midwifery students coming to my hospital. I'm in a relationship with one of the local university for training of midwives, and our midwives do outstandingly well and don't feel disadvantaged by being in a medical model.
Okay. That's proof then. Thank you. Do midwives deal with miscarriages, or is that usually a doctor?
I guess it depends. Early miscarriage is, say before 12 to 14 weeks. It's typically a medical intervention.
Okay.
If a woman's having midwifery care and has a loss early, and she's met a midwife early in the pregnancy, of course the midwife would support her through that. But where the midwife has a very important role is when women have late pregnancy losses, where the baby may have died, in the mid-trimester, or in fact the baby has been diagnosed with an abnormality and the woman chooses to terminate the pregnancy. So those women actually come in and labour.
Okay, right. So, wow, that must be quite traumatic for them and for you.
We call them butterfly babies, and midwives do a fabulous job in supporting these families in a very distressing time and trying to give them the time with their baby and acknowledge the baby as a person. Even nowadays, we have a thing called a cold cot. So it's like a crib with a refrigeration system in it and a mattress, and so that if a woman has a loss, her baby can stay in the room with her. And so, yeah, that's a bit. It's not depressing. It's a fact of life. It happens, and I think in decades ago, women had losses and they weren't acknowledged. And I think now it's acknowledged, and I think that's important.
I think that's amazing that you can keep your baby with you for a little bit so that, your baby doesn't have to die without you ever seeing what he or she looked like and without them ever seeing you. I think that's really wonderful that medicine or technology has come that far. It's not something to be taken lightly.
I even had a family who wanted to take their baby home, and I learned between when it was born and when they were going to have a funeral, and I loaned them a cold cot to take home and have.
Did you? Wow.
Yeah, so they could have their baby at home for a couple of days.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. So, I personally know a lot of women who work in healthcare, like my mum, as you know, but many girls, I don't think many girls are as lucky to grow up knowing such ambitious female doctors, female nurses, female midwives. I would love to know, working as a woman in healthcare, do you feel respected by your male colleagues and by patients? Do patients respect you?
Yes, I think patients definitely. And when you look at when they do those surveys about the most trusted professions, in the community, nurses and midwives are always way up there on the top. You know, our male colleagues, yes, I think things have changed. I mean, I started nursing in the 70s. So the nurses then, we've gone very, we've moved away from that sort of handmaiden type. I remember when I was a student midwife, and I was a student midwife in the 90s, and I was sent to a small community hospital, and I'd been nursing for many years. So I was probably in my mid-30s when I did midwifery. So I go out to this small community hospital, and I was working in the antenatal clinic, and the charge, they still called them charge sister back in that, even then. It was, I mean, this hospital, I started to call it Bedrock District Hospital because I felt like I'd stepped back, a couple of thousand years. And I was directed to the Noritaka tea set. And I said, what for? To make the morning tea for the obstetrician. And I said, well, if he wants a cup of tea or coffee, he can make it himself. But I was surprised that in the mid-90s there were still those attitudes. But I think it's very different. When I did midwifery as the first university course in the country, and it was a graduate program, and I was very lucky to be involved with the most fabulous obstetrician. He was outstanding, and he was the educator for the obstetric department of the Faculty of Medicine. So in my second year of midwifery, we did our women's health component with the fourth year medical students. So we did lectures together, we did presentations together, and I think that was really valuable. And I think that sort of collaborative education is important to develop mutual respect.
That's good. I mean, yeah, I can imagine how easy it is to maintain the hierarchy that has existed for so long of doctors at the top and, well, male doctors at the top and then female doctors after that. And then I'm glad that's dismantling.
But what I would say for women to aspire into senior positions, I think we have to work harder and be better.
I'm glad at least the patients respect you. That's great to hear. That's great. Basic levels of respect have been attained. Good.
I think midwives stand out differently somewhat to nurses. I remember when the midwives decided to wear different uniforms to nurses at the large public hospital, and we chose to wear purple scrubs because purple being a feminist colour, it seemed like the right way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the most recognisable uniform. Staff would get on local buses and the bus driver would say, oh, you're a midwife. I was on a Zoom meeting today, and I was just saying to someone how impressed I was that they were talking about nursing and midwifery, because we often don't recognise midwifery as a separate profession. And nowadays, midwives are, most midwives are direct entry, doing a 3-year undergraduate degree just in midwifery.
Yeah.
So it's not that I don't recognise nurses. I think it's really valuable, and I see myself as a nurse and a midwife. But I think it's important to recognise midwifery as a field in its own.
I wonder if perhaps it's not often recognised. I might be thinking too deep here, but because we don't prioritise the health of women at all.
I don't think people think about midwives and midwifery until you're needing our support.
Yeah, right.
I don't think it enters into people's heads that there's such a thing as a midwife until you need a midwife.
I would love if you could answer some very basic questions about labour and delivery. That sure. if you're able to simply explain them, I think that'd be really useful, because we hear these terms thrown around a lot, and I bet none of us actually know what they are. Number one, what is an episiotomy?
An episiotomy is a surgical incision with a pair of scissors cutting into a woman's perineum. So the perineum's that bit of an area between your vagina and your anus. And that's done, and it's the soft tissue, and that's done to expedite the birth of the baby, maybe because we've got some distress, fetal distress.
Okay. Does that have anything to do with then, if you're did you say expediting the baby?
Yes, so to hurry it along.
Okay. So is that anything to do with, like, if you didn't have to hurry along, would the perineum stretch, not perineum stretch, would the mother stretch? Yeah.
The perineum, absolutely. So what we want is the perineum to stretch.
Okay.
And there's things women can do during pregnancy. They can do perineal massage, get their partner to do perineal massage, and some olive oil or almond oil just to massage and stretch the vaginal tissue. I don't think you can, it doesn't matter how much perineal massage and stretching you do, you're not going to stretch it up to the distance a baby's head's going to come through. But what it can do is it gives women that experience of the pressure on the perineum, and it can teach them to breathe through and control that, that discomfort, so that when the baby is being born and the head is coming down, and because the baby doesn't come out as an expulsive, you watch on television, I used to think they just fell out.
Yep.
And then they don't. And I was really surprised when I first saw a baby being born. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is taking such a long time. But that tissue, your perineal tissue, I think women should get very intimate with their own anatomy and have a feel inside and feel where their cervix is, and, the perineal tissue and the vaginal tissue. It's really quite thick. So all of that has to stretch to be really paper thin to let the baby's head come out. Sometimes a woman can have a little tear in the skin, and it needs stitches to repair. Sometimes it just is small enough that the skin comes together and it will heal normally anyway. Some practitioners believe to stop the woman from having a tear, they cut an episiotomy.
Yeah,
but if you cut it, if you choose to cut an episiotomy, you don't know if the woman's needed it or not. So she's always going to have the discomfort of a scar to be repaired and to have to sit on for the next 6 weeks. I thought I'd look for some statistics for you. So I looked at the Australian Health and Welfare, and it said that the episiotomy rate, so they do these statistics based on women having their first baby, because the outcomes of women having their first baby is often a guide to what's going to happen to them in subsequent births. So it said that the episiotomy rate in Australia is 77.6% of women having vaginal births. I was astounded. So I pulled off my stats in my hospital, and ours is like 11.9%.
That's an alarming difference. My goodness.
Extraordinary.
I think, I can't speak to this, but I've heard that there's a lot of unnecessary intervention now that is purely sort of, I guess you could say, to save time. A lot of the time I know that women commonly tear because they felt rushed through their birth, whereas if they had been, this is simplifying it, of course, but if they had the time that they needed, women often say, I felt I was going to tear on that push, and that was when I tore. And so if maybe they just hadn't pushed on that one because no one was in such a hurry.
Certainly, in my practice, I've never been one who says, to the woman, take a big breath, push, 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 push. Women can breathe the baby out, let the skin stretch up. There are times, because of the baby's heart rate might be dipping down, that you do want to rush things along. And that's entirely different. But in normal supported labour with a healthy woman and a healthy baby, we should let the woman's body do its work. Birth is a physiological experience, and we have turned it somewhat into pathology. Women really underestimate their own power.
I think it's really sad that we don't raise women to know that they can be empowered giving birth, especially considering there's I absolutely don't think there's anything wrong with a cesarean, but I know that cesarean rates have also increasingly gone up, and that is a case where you do have to just relinquish all control because you physically cannot control what you're doing, and so that becomes sort of the norm to relinquish control in all birth situations. And I feel really sad that birth is so scary to many of us and is not considered an empowering experience. It's not like, it can be empowering without being pleasant. I'm sure a lot of people would agree that their birth was very painful. But I really want to do a better job as a society of raising women and girls growing up to understand that, yeah, you're right. They can be empowered during their birth experience in a lot of cases. I suppose not in all, of course, but in a lot of them.
But it all starts with the care that they receive in pregnancy and the support, and how their primary carer normalizes pregnancy and childbirth. I think fear is an enormous factor, and I think midwives could be well placed going to schools and, educating young women and young men about physiological changes in a woman's life through pregnancy. And I think if we demystify it from an early age, it would make a huge difference.
I could not agree more. That is why I started About Your Body. I think it's so harmful that we allow women or teach girls to think. I mean, it happens with men as well, but I can't speak to that experience because I didn't grow up a young boy. We teach young girls that their body is so scary, and we don't tell them anything about it. And we tell them to have sex because they should, and it's not supposed to be enjoyable, and you should only do it in a committed married relationship, and then give birth even though it's very painful, but it'll be worth it because you have your baby. And I think there's definitely different ways to look at it, which is, birth can be an empowering experience. Even your natural menstrual cycle, I find, can be an empowering experience as well, whereas we grow up teaching it to be something that's just really fucking annoying and you wish you didn't have to go through. And yeah, it is annoying, I agree, but we don't have to teach people that that's all it has to be. But actually, speaking of cesareans, could you give us a short explanation as to what one is and why someone might need, or you've already touched on why someone might want one, but why someone might need one, even if they don't want one?
So cesarean section is the birth of a baby through the abdomen. The small cuts made just above your pubic hairline, if anybody has pubic hairs anymore. I don't think so. But where your pubic hair used to be, there's a small incision made through the skin and then into the uterus and stretched open, and the baby is pressed down from, you've seen a pregnant woman's tummy, you press down the top of the tummy and the baby's birthed through there. And I mean, it can be a very beautiful experience for the family, and we take lots of photos of cesarean births as well. So those women who might need cesarean are women who have complex medical histories where natural birth would put their health at risk. It could be because babies had grown at a much greater rate than would meet the woman's pelvic size. So, for instance, women who are diabetics and their diabetes is poorly controlled can have very big babies, and we're looking at like 11, 12-pound babies, and they are not going to fit through down your vajayjay.
Yeah, okay. So if your baby's head's in the 99th percentile, you will likely need a cesarean.
The other thing is, if when we look at cesarean section rates, they vary demographically, and you can look at, anyone can get onto the New South Wales Health website. We all enter our outcomes from every hospital in New South Wales into a perinatal database, so anybody can find out any information. So cesarean section rates vary from women giving birth in Moree to women giving birth in the eastern suburbs of Sydney.
Of course.
And the other reason women could have caesarean section is those women who choose to labour and then end up with an emergency caesarean section. And that's about 13 to 15% of women giving birth. And that's remained unchanged for probably the last 20 years. So there could be some fetal distress or any complication that's happened during labour. But, that is only 13 to 15% of women.
Okay.
The rest of it are generally around, probably related to the model of care you might choose. There is a higher relationship between private obstetric care and midwifery care as the primary carer.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. And if your baby is breech, are you likely to be referred for a caesarean as well?
Yes.
Yep. Sorry for the listeners, breech means upside down, facing the wrong way.
Being born by their bottom. But, when I worked in the public hospital system, the obstetrician I spoke about, who was the educator, he did breech births, and he's now moved to another major hospital in the state, and they're doing most of the breech births. The problem is the skills have been lost. Okay. So they did try to do a trial many years, maybe in the early 2000s, the breech trial, but they randomized women with breech presentations to have a vaginal birth or a caesarean section. But what you need is buy-in from the women. You need the women to be well informed, make choices, and have a plan of how the breech birth is going to go, and when you are going to, where you get to in the labour that you're going to continue, or you decide to move on to an operative delivery. And because that was a completely unethical way to do a trial, it didn't really give you good results. So we couldn't really use the evidence to say one thing or the other. But I know at the hospital I worked at, we had some really great outcomes. It
really frustrates me that they would just throw women around like that rather than, I understand you need equal amounts in a trial. That's, how a trial works. But it saddens me that those women didn't have a say over which birth they got.
So we chose not to participate in it, but when I read the outcomes a few years later, they stopped the trial because people were being randomized into groups where the skill set wasn't there to support.
That's just not safe, really. Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. What is the thing that we call an afterbirth?
The afterbirth's the placenta, which is, how do I describe it? It's about this big. It weighs about the sixth of a baby's weight. And it looks like, for want of a better word, it looks like a big chunk of steak.
Okay.
And it's attached to the wall of the woman's uterus, and the baby's umbilical cord comes out the other side. And that's the interface where the blood flow from the mother, so all the nutrients go through the cord to the baby to help it grow. So if you can look at placentas, and people do lovely tattoos and drawings of placentas looking like trees, because that's just what they look like. They grow. Right. And we midwives, we love placentas. Once the baby's born and the mother gets and you have a cuddle, we go out to our dirty utility room and we put the placenta out and we examine it and we look at the membranes that have held the baby. So it's like a little plastic bag that holds the baby in the uterus. So we check those, we check the cord, we check the vessels. So we really examine the placenta well.
Sounds fascinating. Speaking about some of those things, now that we sort of know what they are, I've come up with a semi-game called Common versus Uncommon to finish us off. Yummy mummy myths versus what really happens. I would love to know. You can just answer yes or no, or you can elaborate on these answers, whatever you feel like doing. But my followers have asked these questions. Actually, I collated them together. Are these actually common occurrences? Number one, getting an episiotomy.
Well, I just said it says 77% of women have episiotomy. I'm stunned.
So yes, I suppose unfortunately it is.
Yes. I mean, I could count on one hand the number of episiotomies I've done in the last 26 years.
Really?
Yeah. So it's like, wow, I was stunned.
Wow, that's striking. Because everybody I know who's given birth has had one, but that's because everybody I know who's given birth is quite young. So I'm going to assume that's why.
No, I think that's even stranger.
Oh, I was thinking like, if it's a new thing.
Yeah, and I was just about to say that my understanding is that there is a new thing on how we manage the pushing stage, the second stage of labour, and doing episiotomy is part of that. And I think I don't know the reasoning behind it, and certainly the medicos that I work with, it's not a contemporary practice for them.
Okay, thank you.
I feel like I put in statistics and we compare them across all the hospitals, obstetric units in our company, and there's many in our group, and I always get questioned, what is wrong with your statistics, Mary? You don't have enough episiotomies. And I'm thinking, what a stupid question to ask me.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting to see the intersection of societal norms with medical intervention. Those two things never seem to be separate. Common occurrence, yes or no, or common or uncommon, having a caesarean section?
Yes. One
common.
in, we're looking common.
Okay.
Probably 33% of women having caesarean section is the average.
Okay.
70% some places, 2% others.
Needing to be induced?
Common. 45%.
Okay. Really? Ooh.
Mm.
Do you know if that's more common with first or second baby, or does it not matter?
So probably across the board.
Okay. So for lack of a better description, pooing during labour and delivery. One of my followers asked that. Is that common?
Yeah, it's common. If you look at some drawings of female anatomy, the baby's head comes down in line with your tailbone.
Right.
And if you look at where the gut and then where the bowel goes, and then that's in that curve, and the baby pushes down into that curve, and if there's any feces in it, it's going to come out because the baby's head's pushing it. The great thing about that is if you poo, your baby's coming soon. So it's not a big deal. And midwives are very discreet in getting rid of it.
Isn't that nice? Now, this one I'm very interested to hear. New mothers actually reporting to you, their midwife, that they have actually had sex 8 weeks after giving birth.
Oh, that long?
They wait that long? That sounds so soon.
No, some in the first week.
Wow. I always thought, that's a man that made up that rule. You can't possibly have sex after 8 weeks. Okay. Right. So it is common then. That's good. That gives me hope that, it obviously is possible. That's really nice. I wonder if if the episiotomy scar changes that.
I'm sure it does.
That sounds, for lack of a better way of saying this, so fucking uncomfortable. That sounds horrible. Okay, last one is fathers fainting in the hospital, in the birth centre or hospital room.
Yeah, they do. I had one who fainted just recently, last year. He was a doctor, and he fainted, and we had to transfer him to the emergency department.
It's almost like men just want to make everything about them.
Oh, it's all about them.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you. This conversation has been not only enjoyable, but incredibly insightful. I claim to know a fair bit about giving birth for somebody who's never ever done it, and I've learnt so much. So thank you. If anyone wants to see the little drawings that the drawings of the female anatomy that Mary is talking about, please head over to my Instagram, because I draw them in a non-threatening way and they're less disgusting than looking it up online. So my last question that I ask all my guests, and I'm very curious to hear your answer, is what is one thing that you personally wish that you had known about your body when you were younger?
That's a really hard one, because I think I knew my body really well. I never felt uncomfortable with my body at any time. But I guess the thing you learn as you age is the resilience of it.
Right.
And if you look after your body, look after yourself, look after your health, your body is so resilient. It can be.
What a wonderful positive note to end on. Thank you so much for being on the show. I have a feeling my listeners are going to absolutely love you, and I will send you the link once this is edited and out. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me and us.
Thanks, Rach.
Thank you so much for listening to the About Your Body podcast. I hope you found joy and comfort in learning about the bio-female body and the power that it holds. In the show notes, you will find links to the About Your Body Instagram page, which is full of free resources and illustrations explaining bio-female anatomy, as well as a link to the About Your Body Etsy store, where my art is available for purchase. And if you're a business, organisation or entrepreneur working in the women's health or women's empowerment space, we could work well together. Please reach out to me via my website, which is www.byrachelholt.com, if you'd like to hire me for graphic design or artistry services. Until next time, here's to learning about our bodies.